Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1808 offered by Mr. Roy of Texas.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman have 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
I thank the chairman. Obviously, we've talked a lot about the issue generally. I might have more to say to respond to a few of the comments made by my colleague, Mr. Raskin, and some others, but I'm going to focus on the amendment currently for the sake of time and try to move forward. That we've discussed, obviously, we just had a vote on an amendment excluding and trying to protect the rights of law-abiding citizens in South Texas and those along the border to be able to defend themselves in the absence of security provided by the federal government, which the Constitution contemplates specifically. And in this case, it's meritorious to consider the danger that is being created for the American people in cities throughout this country, in cities in particular that in jurisdictions that have reduced their law enforcement budgets and what we might generally say defund the police. In Austin, for example, which I represent, Austin cut $150 million in their police budget, about a third of that budget, decimated the recruiting classes of the police academies, made it very difficult to hire. They've been losing police by the dozens, by the hundreds in terms of where they are. Their numbers are at historic lows relative to the growth of the population in Austin. And I would note that that has resulted in significant increased crime in a great number of jurisdictions across this country. In Austin, for example, it saw its deadliest year on record with 89 homicides, annihilating the former record of 59. We're currently on pace to match last year's record, having had 39 homicides through the first half of this year. Chicago reached at least 800 homicides in 2021, a level not seen in 25 years. Portland recorded 90 homicides last year, shattering the city's previous high of 66. New York recorded a 44% increase in homicides. Seattle saw their homicide rate increase by 61% in 2020. And what do these cities have in common? Each of those cities defunded the police or cut officer positions after the summer of 2020. And the bad policies and bad rhetoric from our leaders got us here. In the 2021, at least 12 major cities broke their previous homicide records. And the defunding efforts have trickled down impacts that will worsen crime. 2021 was the deadliest year for law enforcement officers in the United States history. Fatalities increased 55%. A lack of law enforcement hurts everyone. The 911 calls aren't being answered in Austin. It's a pervasive problem, and I've been reading stories about that in jurisdictions and cities throughout the country. Aggravated assault is up in Austin. Crime is up. And all of this gets back to the point of the ability of the American people to defend themselves. And I would note, as the gentleman from Florida noted, I'm not here to suggest that a full presence of law enforcement or a fully funded law enforcement necessarily should give us any great comfort to the point of what we obviously witnessed in Uvalde. Now, I'm still waiting for reports to figure out which law enforcement to blame, but there's no question that there is blame to go around across the various law enforcement levels as we continue to get the reports, as we saw the reports that were released last week, or I think it was last week, earlier this week, in the Texas legislature. It's an appalling situation, but again, I'm going to reserve judgment officer by officer until I get the full reports, or department by department. But the point remains is that the ability for the citizenry, the ability for the people to defend themselves and arm themselves is nevertheless important. And that is something that, of course, in certain jurisdictions across the country have allowed schools to have teachers be able to arm themselves. There are certain jurisdictions in the state of Texas, including some that I represent, that have chosen that path to be able to defend themselves or defend the schools. And I think that we're trying to have a debate here about specifically targeting certain weapons. Obviously, I disagree with that underlying premise, disagree with taking that right away from the citizens broadly and generally, and frankly, very much in line and agreement with the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Sparks, with her rhetoric, from her firsthand account and knowledge of what she experienced in Ukraine and watching her former countrymen and countrywomen deal with the invasion by Russia and the fact of what they're dealing with in Ukraine. She very eloquently laid out why the fundamental right is so important in this country and should be enjoyed and experienced by all. But obviously, we're dealing with legislation that would strike that right with respect to a class of weapons. Again, I disagree with, but I would like to preserve that right for individuals to be able to defend themselves, as earlier I said, along the southern border, which is being ignored by the federal government to the peril of the people of Texas, but in addition to the jurisdictions that have chosen in a fairly, I think, coordinated national way, but certainly individually in each city, in a number of cities, including Austin, to defund their police. And for that, I would ask for an exemption for the people in those jurisdictions, and I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does the gentleman insist on his point of order?
I do not, Mr. Chairman.
Point of order is withdrawn. Recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. First, let me, with respect to defunding the police, let me point out a few facts. Large cities with Democratic mayors spend far more money on policing and hire far more police officers than large cities with Republican mayors. The 25 largest Democratic-run cities employ 75% more police officers than the 25 largest Republican-run cities on a per capita basis. The 25 largest Democratic-run cities spend 38% more on policing than the 25 largest Republican-run cities, again on a per capita basis. And Democrats have supported funding for law enforcement, while Republicans have repeatedly voted against it. But in any event, even if that weren't true, which it is, but even if it weren't true, it is ridiculous to say that someone needs military weapons of war or assault weapons of the type banned by this legislation because they live in a jurisdiction where the police budget went down. We do not expect people to use military weapons of war on the streets. That way lies chaos and mayhem. So I oppose the amendment, and I yield back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Speak on the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
This gets at something I made reference to. Is this the mic? Oh, I got the wrong mic on? Sorry, thank you. This gets at something I made reference to earlier. And let me give some statistics. Mother Jones magazine, I'm not sure it's the most reliable thing in the world, but has a database of mass shootings, and it covers 2007 to 2017. So over that 10-year period, there were 495 people murdered in mass shootings. And about half of those were murdered by a perpetrator with a weapon like an AR-15. Over the same time frame, FBI annual crime reports show that there were 150,000 plus homicides in total, of which 103,901 involved firearms. So again, same 10-year period, 253 people killed by the weapons substantially at issue in this bill, the AR-15 type guns, rifles, semi-automatic, centerfire semi-automatic rifles. And yet, more than 100,000 died in firearm accidents, which brings me back to the question. We start off with the arguments by the majority in support of this bill, the chairman's candid acknowledgement that it flouts, that it defies the Supreme Court's holding as to the protected status of weapons in common use, and then the other very emotional personalized attacks on Republican members for debating the merits of the bill, and the avoidance of this question. If the horrific things that all of us see happening really bother you, why is your bill trying to take care of 253 out of 100,000 gun homicides? Why is that? And at the same time, to the point Mr. Roy makes with this amendment, Democrats, and of course there's always the denial that you did it, and then we trot out everybody's statements, including lots of members on this committee statements embracing the idea of defunding police, abolishing police. And in 2020, 5,000 more homicides in that year because of your rhetoric, because of what you favored. Of those, 65% suffered by African Americans. That's more than 3,500 additional killings. And what do? You come in with a bill to undertake another episode of massive resistance to the United States Supreme Court, just like Democrats have before, in denying a civil right to Americans. And you deal with something that affects maybe 250 murders. Let's say it's gone up some. Let's say you triple that. It's still nothing compared to the additional killings just of African Americans you've precipitated. Why is that? What you want to do is to leave Americans in the crime-ridden cities you've given rise to, left to the tender mercies of the criminals. You don't want them to be able to defend themselves with weapons in common use. That's your position. And your position, you say, is responsible, and Republican questioning of your position is irresponsible. I must confess, I don't follow your logic. I don't follow your logic. I think what we should do is we should grapple with the conditions that you've created. That's what we should do. And you're not doing that. And if anybody can tell me over there how many killings this will prevent, I'd like to know. And I hope you'll combine it with an explanation of why you're not grappling with the problem. And that the only thing you're interested in doing is defying the United States Supreme Court and denying the constitutional rights of law-abiding Americans. You want time? I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I rise in opposition to the amendment, and I question the logic of whether or not 253 lives are worth our efforts here today. I mean, 747 may be killed by guns if we pass this today, but we would also save 253 lives. Those are valuable lives. Life is valuable. And by the way, the people who are here today who have suffered loss as a result of gun violence, I want to offer my deepest sympathies. And I thank you all for coming to see us today. Stand up to the NRA for a change. You know, the NRA have been, and the pro-gun interests have spent a lot of money. They dump a ton of money onto 99% of which goes to the Republicans in Congress. 99% of the tons of money that the pro-gun folks drop on Congress every session goes to my friends in the Republican Party. And so if you connect the dots, you understand why we have such opposition to common sense gun reform measures in this country. You know, back in 2004, when the ban on assault weapons came off, then what did we see? We saw a rise, a dramatic rise in the use of assault weapons, military-style assault weapons, to commit mass murders in America. Who needs, by the way, a 15 projectile clip to defend their home? I mean, we're not in Ukraine, we're not in Vietnam, we're not in South Korea. This is not World War II or the Korean War. You know, we live in a civil society. We live in a society where everyone should have the right to feel safe. And I know that we're never going to get rid of all of the handguns out there. Nobody is asking for that, although it would be a good thing if people in America learn how to live together without fearing each other, without despising each other, without wanting to kill somebody. There's some people who walk around with that mentality, just looking, they got a hair trigger. And when you put a hair trigger weapon in the hands of such a person, then you get the epidemic of mass murder that we are experiencing in this country today. So, I mean, it's common sense. Let's stop pretending that we need military-grade assault weapons to defend our homes. We don't need that kind of firepower. We're just itching to be able to use it because we don't value human life. 253 lives don't matter. Well, it matters to me, and I know that it matters to you because you wish that your loved one could have been within that group. And if it ever happens to me, I'll be feeling just like you feel. And I think that's just humanity. When something like that happens, all of the money from the NRA and from the pro-gun groups doesn't really matter. But by then, it's too late. So, you know, what we're doing today, we have an opportunity to do the right thing and to stand up to the NRA, let them know once and for all that we stand with the people of this country. People of this country don't want assault weapons. And so I've heard a lot of arguments today, a lot of nonsense. Let's just stop the nonsense and get rid of the assault weapons, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
I can assure my colleague that I don't take any money from the NRA. I give them money because I'm a lifetime member, and I don't take any money from any political action committees, regardless of their ideology or perspective. And so, you know, to question the motives of our members, I think doesn't align with certainly my experience in politics. And I would invite my colleagues on the Democratic side, if you'd like to join me in not taking PAC money, I would certainly welcome you with that. So let's not question each other's motives. And the fallacy in my colleague's argument is that this gun control will in fact save lives, when the amendment points out that the need for firearms goes beyond just the constitutionally prescribed rationale, that people in unsafe communities, communities that have been made less safe as a consequence of policies that have been instituted by Democrats at the state and local level, necessitate personal protection and self-protection. And the legislation even sort of admits through its drafting that there will be a great deal of firearms that are on the streets and that are available to people that might do harm. And we want to make sure that the rights are also reposed in those who wouldn't, law-abiding Americans who want to protect themselves and protect their families. And so I think you see in these series of amendments, we're trying to probe how reasonable Democrats are ever going to be on this issue. We already know our colleague on the committee from the state of Missouri, Ms. Bush, consistently and fervently advocates for the defunding of police. Now, the Democrats who are often present in the committee like to pretend as though that's not part of the lexicon and the paradigm for national Democrats. But when someone on the Judiciary Committee is just entirely hell-bent on defunding the police as part of the Democrat agenda, it certainly gaslights these decisions at the local level that deprive law enforcement of needed public safety resources. So in these amendments, we're saying, well, look, if you want to take people's guns, can you at least not take people's guns if they're living on the border and your policies have created a dangerous cartel-infested turnstile in their communities? And your answer was no. And then we said, well, beyond the border, in areas where you see these dramatic reductions in public safety budgets, where people are being essentially left to fend for themselves as Joe Biden is moving MS-13 to live next door, can we at least allow those folks to have personal protection and protection of their homes and families? I can speak on behalf of my constituents in Florida who greatly value the stand your ground law, the law that puts really the presumption on the side of someone who's being attacked, not on the side of an attacker. And for the stand your ground law to be fully vindicated in its application and use, people have to have the full complement of their Second Amendment rights. and that's why I'm grateful to support Mr. Roy's amendment. I would yield the gentleman from Texas my remaining time.
I appreciate the gentleman from Florida. And I would just add, like, going back, what's the purpose of this amendment? And the gentleman from Florida articulated it, and it's piggybacking on the back of the purpose of the first amendment that was offered with respect to the border. And it is that the very policies that have been promoted and that are currently actively being promoted by the Democratic Party are endangering the American people. And by the way, endangering the migrants that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are wrongfully saying that somehow there'd be South Texans wanting to line up to shoot, which defies all of the logic of all of the things that I know the gentlelady from Texas knows about the ranchers in South Texas who are heartbroken about the dead bodies they're finding on the ranches, the mobile morgues in Brooks County, Texas. Currently, 48 dead migrants. I think probably more. That was a 2-week-old number. 107 last year. That's the reality of South Texas. These ranchers are heartbroken to find a dead body on their ranch. The vast majority of the people living in South Texas are people who are Hispanic. The white owners of ranches and white people in the South Texas are in the minority. This is not about targeting migrants, and the insinuation that that's the case is absurd. The fact of the matter is, a lot of ranchers do in fact have AR-style rifles. A lot of ranchers have they desire to be able to defend their families on their ranches and concerned about danger. I've got picture after picture of guns that have been confiscated from migrants that have been, and smugglers and coyotes that are in cars operated by cartels up in the United States. We had a car in San Antonio and Bernie with 9 people in the car. It was being driven by an American citizen employee of the cartel, moving human beings for profit, getting ready to put them in a stash house. That was happening in Bernie, Texas, a suburb of San Antonio. That's the reality. One of the members on the other side of the aisle said you don't use AR-15s for defense. I read into the record a little earlier the exact opposite of that. In Harris County, Texas, a 15-year-old with an AR-15 defended himself and his 12-year-old sister from 2 home invaders in Houston, Texas. And Texas with an AR took down 3 drive-by shooters, emerging unscathed. The man with an AR defended himself and 3 others from a gang of 7 masked and armed criminals. It just isn't true. We're just stating things that are simply not true. I'd yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island